Each year in St. Louis, one thing that I do each year is give a compare and contrast platform address to introduce or to deepen understanding of some aspect of ethical humanism, ethical culture. We tend to use ethical humanism in St. Louis. There's, I think...
Would you be able to speak up a little more?
Okay,
I've heard from one that it's we don't have an amplification system set up, so...
Yes, I will do that. So I've given about a dozen of these compare and contrast platforms. They are available on our website, on our podcast page, so if any of you are interested in kind of learning more about some history and how ethical humanism compares to other traditions, you're welcome to check those out. This time I'm going to be talking about the connections between ethical humanism and progressivism, both historically and in the fact that today many ethical humanists identify as progressives, or if you describe what a progressive is, they'd say, oh yeah, that sounds like me. But at the same time, ethical societies seek to be welcoming congregations and not political organizations. So how does that work both in principle and in practice, where you have a lot of sort of like-minded people, and we talk about how we come to ethical societies in part because we're seeking like-minded people, but also want to be open-minded and welcoming to people from different kinds of views so that you can have dialogue. So I'm going to start with some history and then move into today. So what is progressivism? It's a political philosophy or movement that really doesn't have a precise definition, especially as used currently every day by people. But it does have a history, and it has some general values that coincide with the history and the values of ethical humanism and ethical societies. But as we'll see, it would be wrong to say that today ethical society members all identify as progressives. People can share the values of ethical humanism while holding a variety of political views in many areas. So again, progressivism is sort of an umbrella term. It covered a variety of reform movements that were addressing problems of the Industrial Revolution and the Gilded Age. And the official progressive era began at the end of the 19th century. And this was the same time that ethical societies were being founded. In New York and Philadelphia and St. Louis, our society was founded in 1886. So this was all kind of happening at the same time. And that wasn't a coincidence because progressivism and ethical societies were responding to many of the same ethical crises in America and kind of looking at the same problems and thinking about how to deal with them. So there are some well-known names that tend to come up in histories of both progressivism and ethical humanism that I hope many of you have heard of. So Jane Addams, how many of you have heard of her, right? A lot of you. She was founder of the Settlement House movement in Chicago. She was also an interim leader of the Ethical Society of Chicago. So she had that connection. Jacob Riis and Louis Hine, many of you have probably heard of them or seen their photographs. They were photojournalists who were documenting the shocking conditions in the tenements in New York City, which really galvanized a lot of people. They both had close ties to the New York Society for Ethical Culture. Ida Wells, she was an anti-lynching activist. W.E.B. Du Bois, I'm sure you've all heard of him. Giant in the early civil rights movement. They were both founders of the NAACP, along with several members and leaders in the ethical humanist movement. So there was a lot of overlap there too. John Dewey, many people have heard of him, considered a major figure in progressivism for promoting educational theories that were based on experience and reflection rather than just sort of rote repetition and memorization and acceptance of past authority. He was looking at a different way to educate people. Dewey sent his children to the ethical culture schools in New York. So progressives founded many private institutions and organizations, and they also promoted government action and regulation to counter the power of big business, as well as to protect minority populations. For example, they founded free public schools while advocating for universal free public schooling. They also founded free private schools. So education, basically free education for everyone, was a big part of the progressive era. As mostly people who were living in urban places and as mostly people who were free thinkers of one way or another, early progressives, they likely believed that government solutions to issues like poverty were more democratic and more practical than private solutions. They saw that fewer people had large extended families to support each other anymore, so you couldn't just rely on families helping each other. And charities at the time were mostly controlled by traditional religious institutions, and since they were free thinkers, they wanted to make sure that people were being cared for by the whole community and that you didn't have to claim a particular belief in order to, get the help that you needed. So they were doing a lot of good. But for all the wide-ranging concerns and rhetoric, many aspects of the progressive movement had ethical blind spots, especially when it came to race and ethnicity. The early labor movement and unions were infamously nativist and racist, and even the movement for reproductive freedom espoused sometimes eugenic racist theories. So they were ahead of their time in some ways and very much of their time in not so good ways. And I think it's important when we look at ourselves and our own movement that we are clear-eyed as well about where we had good ideas and where we did not. Because early ethical humanism was also guilty of such blindness in some ways. David Muzzy was an ethical leader. He was author of Ethics as a Religion. I don't know if you guys have that book. It's a really good book. He was also a historian who wrote popular high school textbooks on American history for several decades in the mid-20th century. And contemporary historians actually see Muzzy's work as presenting a generally progressive view, but also a false narrative of America, that kind of exceptionalist, triumphant, mostly white European people coming over and fixing everything and being great, and kind of a racist interpretation of Reconstruction. So I think it's really interesting on the one hand how he can have idealistic and high values and write this, I think, very beautiful book about ethics as a religion. On the other hand, still be very much of his time as far as not understanding the worth of all people in a really deep way. Ethical humanism over our history, which is 145-ish years old now, I think. We've grown in a lot of ways. We've sought to build on and expand the values of progressivism. We've tried to extend the reach of progress to more populations. I think that's one of the ways that we have most grown as ethical people and as a philosophy and a worldview, is kind of expanding that circle. So we joined the movement for equal rights for LGBT people as early as the 1970s. And today there's broad support in our movement for the Black Lives Matter movement, particularly in St. Louis, but across the country, I know. So I would say that we have a lot to be proud of, both in our history and in our activities today. And we also have history to not be proud of. And we have a long way to go still to truly live our mission of affirming the worth of every person. So we can be proud, for instance, of supporting the Black Lives Matter movement, and we can recognize that one of the reasons that movement is needed today is in part because the promises of progressivism of the past have not been realized for everyone, and certainly not for African Americans. And part of that is because for over 100 years, white progressives said in many beautiful ways, and I have a background in poetry, so when I read these words of these old progressives, they're really lovely. These ideas that all people matter, that all lives matter, while at the same time we can understand now that we are being complicit in racist systems, whether that's redlining or white flight or the resegregation of the public school system, which has certainly been happening in St. Louis, and I would guess in this area as well. White nepotism and employment, and the criminal justice system in general having a lot of problems, and so on. So I think we can take heart from what we've done, and we can learn from where we didn't do it so well, and kind of figure out what we need to go forward. And so I think it's important to say that although many of the specific social problems that were addressed by the progressive era were done so I think positively. Sometimes I think because we still have problems, people tend to just say, oh, nothing worked and, we never fixed anything. But things have gotten a lot better in many ways. Some of the things that were very important to early ethical culturists included child labor and voting rights for women, for instance. And we can be clear-eyed about the fact that there are many problems that today are back. They're either back in new forms or they never really went away at all. And that could be extreme inequality, abuse of workers, poverty and inadequate health care, lack of educational opportunities, racial and ethnic strife, and struggles between superstition and science, corruption and money in politics, and I could go on with a laundry list of things that we still need to fix. And today, America is again in crisis. I think a lot of people feel that. And many ongoing crises are coming to the forefront. Many people are worried that our country is really falling apart, that we're facing some kind of catastrophic failure. But I think that it's important to also be hopeful and to be motivated to continue work. And part of that, to me, is having hope. Because if we use history as our guide, it seems to me that America is also ripe for a new era of sweeping reform that will bring us to the next level of progress as individuals and as a country, a kind of new progressive era. And today we have a lot more resources than the progressives in the past did. We have more knowledge, we have more people. I really think that we have the opportunity for truly broad ethical reform. So historically, ethical humanism is considered part of the progressive movement, which was in part a political movement. But however, as I said, and as you know, ethical societies are not political organizations. We are communities of individuals and families with shared values. The values in your statement of purpose, who seek to live more ethical lives, who seek to raise the next generation to be ethical actors in the world that they will inherit. And politically, I think it's important to know that progressivism originally was bipartisan. Theodore Roosevelt and Howard Taft were Republican presidents, and they were considered progressives. They were breaking up monopolies, they were increasing regulations on business to ensure fair competition, healthier capitalism. And then Democrat Woodrow Wilson succeeded them and continued progressive reforms. And then, of course, Democrat Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal reforms were a massive progressive response to a massive market failure of the Great Depression. But so we can look back and see people on both sides of the aisle, as it will. Today, it seems like we're in a different situation. Progressivism has become a synonym for liberal. And in part, that's because liberal has become a dirty word that nobody wants applied to them anymore. So liberals are looking for a label with less baggage, and progressive sounds positive and forward-thinking and connected to change. And those are things that those of us who are liberal like. But many of the fundamental values of progressivism are universal. And I think that's shown by the fact that many ideas and programs originally championed by progressives are considered mainstream foundations of American society today. And that's everything from public schools. I mean, just the existence of public schools used to not be a thing. To Social Security and unemployment insurance, to basic health and safety regulations. There can be arguments about sort of what exactly these things should look like, but the fact that we have any kind of basic safety net at all, I think is a very broadly accepted mainstream idea. So it's really unfortunate that today this extreme partisan divide in our country has politicized many issues that logically should be universal. Climate change is the biggest example, right? Climate change does not care about what your politics are, and when the waters are rising, nobody's going to say, well, I don't believe in climate change, so I don't feel any of this water in my hands. It's a problem for everyone. It's a problem for every species on Earth. It should be a common enemy for environmentalists and multinational corporations. Whether or not you like multinational corporations, a healthy environment is good for them too. And I do think that we are getting there, and that there's a lot more people of every kind of political stripe who are understanding that, although unfortunately it's happening too slowly. The proliferation of guns is another issue that should bring disparate communities together, because gun violence is, of course, decimating urban minority communities, and the easy availability of guns is a major contributor to the rising suicide rate of rural white men. The biggest number of people being killed by gun violence today are rural white men. So that's something that should bring people together. Similarly, people of all sexualities and genders are born into every kind of family every day. So dignity and respect and basic human rights for one's own family members should be the most universal of values. And at Ethical Societies today, we welcome anyone who shares our values to join us, whether they consider themselves progressive or conservative or anywhere in between. We can agree on values such as the worth and dignity of every person, and we can still honestly disagree sometimes about what exactly affirming worth and dignity looks like in action, or what it looks like in policy, or what kind of legislation actually supports the worth and dignity of each person. So we need to guard against, I think, in ethical society that becomes an echo chamber, or a group in which everyone agrees on everything, or that never airs disagreements because, I'm not sure that other people are going to like this. I think an ethical society that became like that would be an ethical society that had really failed in its mission. We really need to be able to speak to each other openly and honestly. But it can be tricky. I'll give you an example. In St. Louis, during the summer we have members who give platforms, and one of our members gave a platform address on the minimum wage. And he argued that raising the minimum wage is actually unfair to business owners and unkind to workers because it could lead to fewer jobs. I don't think the research supports his view, but I know that person and other members at our society who consider themselves sort of fiscally conservative and who also question the effectiveness of raising the minimum wage, I know that they have the same fundamental values as society members who do support raising the minimum wage. Our values as ethical humanists don't always clearly point to a particular solution to an ethical dilemma, particularly because one of our values is research and empirically finding out what works and what doesn't, and that can take a while to kind of figure out. But what those values do clearly point to, I think, is how we should treat each other in having that conversation. How to treat each other when we disagree. We should try to make our case to each other using facts and arguments and personal stories, which are very powerful. And as we do that, we should treat each other with fairness and kindness. I was really kind of saddened that after this platform on the minimum wage, I received more than one complaint that this view was aired at an ethical society at all. But not just that, but assumptions that the person who gave this talk must be a terrible person. They must not have any compassion for poor people, etc. When in fact, the person who gave this talk, I know very well. He is one of the most generous and ethically active people in our society, probably. He's one of the few who actually goes out and feeds the homeless and helps to find them shelter on the coldest days. So this guy's putting his values where his mouth is. He just has a different theory about the minimum wage. So that was an interesting conversation to have with people, to say, well, you can have a different view on this and not be an evil person. Can you all still hear me? So, ethical societies welcome a variety of views. But are there boundaries as to what a person can believe while still correctly claiming to promote ethical humanist values? Is there some kind of boundary, or can you just say anything and believe anything and say, I'm an ethical humanist? I do think that we have boundaries and that we need boundaries, otherwise, there's no there. So for instance, I don't care what kind of torturous logic a person might use. It seems to me that ethical humanism is incompatible with beliefs or actions that denigrate the worth of any human beings. So that includes, white supremacism, racism, anti-Semitism, sexism, homophobia. The foundational belief of ethical humanism is the universal worth of all people, and our primary mission is to uphold the worth of all people by working for justice and dignity and an equitable opportunity for happiness for all people. So an ethical society should not be a place where it's ever okay to be hateful, but it should be a place where it's okay to be wrong. And that is where the difficult line comes in, right? At least subjectively. I'm sure that there are people right now who are spewing white supremacist or misogynist arguments who would deny that they hate people of color or women. But I like that saying that we don't have to be so open-minded that our brains fall out. You heard that one? I think that we can make judgments about what reasonable people would consider hate speech or positions that deny universal worth and dignity. And I think that we can denounce those positions. We can also make judgments about theories that fly in the face of overwhelming scientific consensus. And we can ethically choose not to give such theories a platform. Literally a platform. So we occasionally will have people who say, well, shouldn't we be debating climate change? No, we are way past debating climate change. But also, ethical humanism can help bring to political activism of all types, I think, compassion and understanding of human frailty. Because right now, I think what a lot of us are experiencing is not just hardening of sides, but hardening within each side. At least this is our experience in St. Louis, that it's not just to be on the right side of every issue, but to be on the right side in the right way in every little way, and people kind of, I think, attacking each other, people who should be allies with each other. We live in the beginning of a new era, for one thing, in which things in the past that might have gone unnoticed or been private, they are now public, and they are archived forever. So I think part of that is going to have to be learning to accept imperfection from each other. Because if we don't, we will not have anyone left considered acceptable to speak about anything. And when I was working on this talk, I tried to come up with an example of someone who might be, the last person left to speak, who would be considered an ethical icon. And every single person that I thought of, or then I'd look it up, turns out to have said or done something that was considered inappropriate by somebody. Like, there's nobody completely pure. So we need to allow each other to make honest and well-intentioned mistakes. And we need to accept sincere apologies. An apology is not a get-out-of-jail-free card, especially for repeat offenders. But I think humanists of all people should understand that normal human beings say thoughtless and even cruel things out of anger or frustration or ignorance or tiredness or having a migraine or who knows. I mean, I know that I have said many things that I would not want on a billboard. And goodness knows that we misunderstand each other all the time. So progressivism and ethical humanism were both founded in the face of great social ills, great social problems, but with a great optimism for the ability of people collectively to make a better society for all. And today, as I said, a lot of folks are not feeling so positive about humanity or the future. Some of you are like, yeah, I'm not feeling so great about humanity right now. But I really feel that despair is the mother of apathy and inaction. And ethical humanism has been first and foremost always about action. The first principle of ethical humanism was act so as to elicit the best in others and in yourself. It wasn't believe or have faith in the best or hope for the best or pray for the best. It was act in a way that will help the best that we can imagine to become real. So with all the hatred and the cruelty that we see, how can we remain optimistic enough about humanity and about the future so that we can stay motivated to act for the expansion of ethical progress? Well, ethical humanism is a naturalistic worldview, meaning one based on tangible evidence and reason and a scientific understanding of the world, including the evolution of humans through unguided natural selection. At the same time, many of the Gilded Age abuses that progressives were fighting were justified by evolutionary arguments. Actually, they were justified by a couple parallel lines of argument. One was theological, which was that God loves rich people, that's why they're rich. So leave them alone, because it's against God to fight inequality. And the other, though, was pseudoscientific. Evolution naturally created rich people through survival of the fittest. Therefore, it's against nature to fight inequality. This was called social Darwinism. Although I hate that term because it's a misuse of Darwin's theory of natural selection. But evolution is greatly misunderstood by many to this day. So it's important to promote scientific understanding of where humans come from and how we developed. The study of biology and archaeology and anthropology all illustrate that humanity is one family and one species. And we come in a beautiful variety, particularly in culture. And we have fundamental universals. We're a social species. We flourish because of our social nature, because mutual support is adaptive. And love and care, as well as competition, are built into us. Our instincts are overall more positive than negative. And I think that's been proved by the fact that we've covered the earth in all our amazing complexity and not just murdered each other. And we have evolved the intellect and the self-consciousness to allow us to choose to go above and beyond our instincts, to become even more mutually supportive across more lines of difference. And I think that we have to keep reminding ourselves and other people of this. Because, again, we live in an age of marvelous technology that has some unfortunate side effects. One is that it magnifies the ugliest of human words and actions. I was a poetry major, not a math major, but approximately speaking, if only 1% of Americans are saying and doing hateful things, speaking hate speech, putting out really egregious things. Only 1% of humanity or of Americans are doing that. That's almost 4 million people. And they're probably very active on Twitter and other places. So I try to do math like that to help me maintain my faith in humanity when I see these things. And I'm like, well, do the math. What percentage of people are actually commenting on the articles in the newspaper, which is like the worst place in St. Louis to see humanity on display? And when we see, white supremacists parading their loathsome ideas, or when we, again, make the mistake of reading the comments, as they say, online, we're talking about a very small percentage of people, which is still a lot of people, but a very small percentage of people. But it's not enough for the good to just outnumber the bad if the good is only personal and quiet and passive. The good needs to be cultivated, it needs to be acted on, it needs to be promoted, it needs to be spread, it needs to have a loud voice. And that is what ethical societies were created to do. in his founding address for the first ethical society in New York, which was on May 15th, 1876, Felix Adler, who was 26 years old, he explained why, given the greed and the moral apathy he saw around him, we don't have that anymore, luckily, right? Greed and moral apathy. And the failure of traditional religion to deal with greed and moral apathy, why he sought to create an ethical movement that was religious in form and function. And this is a little bit of a paraphrase of his words. Statesmen and philanthropists are busy suggesting remedies for the cure of these great evils. But the renovation of our civil service, the reform of our primaries, and whatever other measures may be devised, they all depend in the last instance upon the fidelity of those to whom their execution must be entrusted. They will all fail unless the root of the evil be attacked, unless the conscience of people be aroused, the confusion of right and wrong checked, and the loftier purposes of our being are again brought powerfully home to the hearts of all. So he was saying, yes, that political and cultural changes were sorely needed, but so were communities of people devoted to personal ethical transformation, to what they put on the side of the building in New York, the knowledge, the practice, and the love of the right, meaning ethical living in all aspects of its life. And he promoted a community of all ages, that our children will be strong even in adversity because they believe in the destiny of humankind and in the dignity of people. And I really like that destiny of humankind and the dignity of people, because again, it's today, but it's also tomorrow. So I'm going to conclude with something personal, and then I hope we have some time that we can talk and I can hear from you. A couple summers ago, we had a total eclipse in St. Louis. How many of you have ever experienced a total eclipse? Everybody's got to do it. We had about 45 seconds of totality, which was like a breath. And I was outside and able to witness it. It was clear. And so you're out there with your glasses on until the very last second. And then the world went dark, and I took off my glasses. And I looked at the moon surrounded by the sun's corona. It's the first time in my life I ever saw that. And I really can't explain it if you haven't experienced it, but it was when I really realized that I was standing on a ball in space. I thought it would be cool, but I wasn't expecting that experience somehow. So much to feel like, oh yeah, we're in space. I'm standing on a ball. Sometimes I think maybe we feel that if we're like high up on a mountain or way out in the ocean. But that recognition that we are animals living on one planet in a solar system, let alone a universe, that we are still only beginning to understand. So I think when we talk about the destiny of humankind, as humanists, we understand that that destiny is not a given. There's no future that's preordained. It's not preordained by an outside force. It's not preordained by any natural law. There's just a species on a ball in space that has developed this amazing ability to envision and to create our destiny and to create the destiny of all the other species on this ball with us. So the vision comes before the creation. The progressives in the past and those of us who are seeking ethical progress today, I think we wonder, why are so many people afraid of social and ethical progress? The future that we envision with equity and equality and peace and dignity, it just seems so beautiful. And a healthy environment, like, why wouldn't everybody want that? And we know that there's something in lots of us that find change really scary, even good sounding change. Environmentally, the scale of change that's needed is really intimidating. Economically, the incredible wealth and corresponding power of the 1% is really daunting. It's kind of easier to beat each other up than to kind of work on that. Culturally, the historical wrongs, let alone the current wrongs, there's so many and so varied that we don't even know where to start. so we can become overwhelmed. Social change to a more equitable system will also mean that many of us will have to give up some privileges that we have taken for granted. But we also need to look at what kind of vision of progress we're offering, I think. One thing that many ethical humanists agree on is that we need new visions and new stories that can inspire more people to embrace a more positive and inclusive future. One of the lessons, I think, of the progressive era is that many in it, they did try to paint a picture of a better world for all. And they had a lot of successes because of that. The picture that they were painting was sometimes pretty limited in who was included in all. And sometimes it was painfully naive about the history of oppressions, but I just think that that shows how much more we have to offer today. Progressivism did make the humanist argument that this life here on earth can and should be better, and that it's up to the people working together to make it so. So ethical humanism, I think, is really in an ideal position to take that foundation of progressivism forward by finally and truly including everybody, and that is a very positive and appealing message. So thank you for listening to me and all staying awake, and I look forward to hearing from you.
Larry, Lawrence, Kate, stay up here. Stay up here. They're talking with you. Conversation.
You were talking about liberal a few minutes, well, 20 minutes ago or whatever. Reminded me of one of the first times one runs into liberal is to go to a restaurant and they look at the menu and it says, we'll give you a liberal portion of something. And it's always a minuscule kind of little thing. And I think that kind of idea of liberal is what pervades a lot of people's minds. But today, think of liberal, I mean a small portion or whatever. Particularly if you look at people in the South, they say, yeah, we have all these liberal governors up there, but what are we getting? The little tiny portions of things. So.
Oh, that's an interesting idea. Yeah, that idea that there's sort of this very limited pie, and that less for me, more for you means less for me, which economically is not really true. But I think trying to help people to understand that you can have more for everybody means more for everybody is really important. Yeah.
So, you mentioned the idea that we are largely, there's a large overlap in it with liberal and ethical culture. And looking at, you told the story of the people who are foundational in forming ethical culture. And now we look back at them, we see what they did wrong. But at the time, as you said, this was backed up by science. They weren't, plucking this thing out of nowhere. They thought that this was true, right? And I wonder what we think is true and that we think we're right about. And in 100 years' time, we will be seen as being unethical people for it. Yeah. And going back to the liberal argument, a little while back we read Jonathan Haidt's book for our book club, and he talks about moral foundation theory. Mm-hmm. And he said, the idea is that there are 5 different foundations. And he makes the point that conservatives have those pretty much balanced, all 5 of them. The liberals are really weighted towards 2, fairness and care. And the other 3 are kind of elective. And so I wondered what we can do about bringing people in that have a wider range of moral foundations into our society, given that we have this already entrenched bias towards the liberal side.
Yeah. A couple of things there. So one is I do like Jonathan Haidt's work is really interesting, and that idea that people are more conservative have a higher sense of concern about like purity or tradition and authority. So I think there's a couple things that you can do. One is really kind of continue to ratchet up people's the feelings about care and harm. And I think one of the reasons why conservatives hate Hollywood is because they're really good at that. Kind of telling the stories of people who are being hurt and activating people's sympathies and connection to other people more. But another way I think is a lot of folks have a wrong idea about history. You know, they think that being pure or that history is some kind of static thing that needs to stay or that we need to go back to. And I think the more that you learn about history, the more that you learn it's all change. It's always change. And so change is not this, you know, impure thing, but that it's part of the human condition. I don't know. I mean, I think that can be part of it. As to your first part, I do think about what the future will think about us. From most ethicists that I've talked to, the areas that they say we're still at the very beginning of have to do with other species. So the assumptions that we make today about the difference between humans and other species, or what other species experience, or what their rights should be. I think when people look back on us today, and some of the things that our relationship with other species, they might be like, oh my God, that's really embarrassing.
They call themselves humanists.
Well, and I think that's okay, because we are humans.
Yeah,
But,
we are, but
yeah.
it's 100 years from now, if we expand the
Membership?
membership.
Yeah, there's some really interesting things going on.
Yeah.
I just, from what you were just saying now too, history, sometimes I've heard people say, well, they talk about history as something that's static and you've read that, so you don't need to read anymore. History is a story. I mean, it's a story that we tell ourselves because we weren't everywhere always. And we really don't know what was happening or what the motives or anything. So we tell ourselves that, and so it's kind of evolution too. And another thing is about the word reform. Reform, it seems in a way it's sort of a generic thing. It doesn't say really whether it's this way or that. It's just change, you know. And so when you hear about Congress or whatever body is talking about reform, and you know, whether it's immigration reform or it's tax reform, what do they mean? And so that term about the devil's in the details, you know, I mean, like, not requiring that people be more specific. What exactly do you mean when you say reform? Is it necessarily a change for good, or as everybody would see it as being good? So I'm wanting to get people to say exactly what they mean by that.
Yeah, and I think it depends on what kind of era or what kind of issue you're dealing with too. I always find it interesting to look at what in ethical societies, what are the points of contention, you know, not just like, oh yeah, we all believe this or we all don't believe that. In St. Louis, we are the home of Monsanto. We have a fair number of members who think that Monsanto is the devil and that, you know, GMOs are going to destroy the world, and can tell you all these reasons why. We also have people who work for Monsanto and who are scientists and who find that a very unscientific point of view, and who are human beings who are trying to, you know, feed the world and do kinds of good things. So that's been a really interesting, rich place for us to have conversations, and again, to figure out how to have those conversations with each other, where we can bring our evidence and we can bring our arguments, but we can also respect each other, or try to respect each other, and say, okay, this is a real person on the other side of this issue, and how can we go forward together? How can we at least have this conversation in a way that at the end of it we still think that we're each, you know, valued human beings?
I have a question. So you have in this room people that work for Monsanto and people that are passionately against it. Why do you think they come together in the same group? What have you done, or what makes that work?
I would say, like, you know, there's lots of other stuff that we do have in common. So so the things that we have in common are much greater. You know, if your Venn diagram or whatever there's a lot there. But I think that's true of most things. You know, we have many things in common with most people. So a lot of the time it's finding, well, what do we have in common so that we can. But that's a particularly tricky issue.
So Kate, thank you for that presentation. It's great, very thought-provoking. And I'm wondering, it sounds as though you perceive the ethical societies today as maybe restricting diversity of opinion and diverse mindsets, and that we should open up more and promote more dialogue from different opinions. Did I get that right?
Well, I think we need to figure out where our boundaries are.
Uh-huh.
I think to make sure that they're not too narrow and that we're not being dogmatic, particularly, we're not theologically, dogmatic, but, are we being politically dogmatic?
Mm-hmm.
But also then not to kind of go the other way and say, oh, well, we're ethical, so we should let anybody say anything.
Mm-hmm.
Because that also I don't think is ethical. So it's finding that place. And to me that has to do with sort of how some foundational beliefs about dignity and worth, but also sort of how people are making their arguments, what they're basing their arguments on, how they're treating each other as they're making those arguments. So that's sort of my concern, is that we do remain a place where we can learn from one of the core values of our Sunday Ethical Education for Kids program is I can learn from everyone. So where we can learn from everyone, but at the same time, that we're not so open-minded that our brains fall out. And that is a very tricky line to find, so it's a constant discussion in the society too.
Any more questions?
Thank you.
All right, thank you, Kate.